So the GPU market is a bit of a mess right now. Nvidia released the RTX series on the pipe dream of real-time ray tracing in games, and just last week AMD released their factory overclocked RX 580, also known as the RX 590. There is some good news though, and that's that pricing for mainstream cards like the GTX 1060 and the RX 580 are pretty much lower than ever. Most notably, the 8GB RX 580 is dipping below $200 these days among several models, and that seems like an absolute steal for those wanting to grab a capable GPU for fast 1080p gaming. And also the 4GB RX 570s are going for just under $150. So today we're going to be seeing how these fairly familiar GPUs stack up in current games with current pricing. Alright, so here is the current stack. We've got the RX 570 4GB, the RX 570 8GB, the 8GB RX 580, and then the 1050 Ti from the green team, and also the 3GB and 6GB GTX 1060. And as I said before, pricing for the majority of these GPUs, mainly the Radeon GPUs from AMD, have come down quite a bit, and they're pretty much lower than ever. And that's great news for people who are upgrading from lower end GPUs or maybe building an entire system this holiday season towards the end of the year. So it's going to be very interesting to see how these GPUs stack up with this lower pricing. Not included in the stack is the 4GB RX 580, but given that it's priced identically to the 8GB model at the moment, it's honestly not worth including. And it's awesome to see these price drops across these mainstream GPUs because it is coming up on that holiday season, like I said, where gamers are going to be building or upgrading their system. The big question is though, which one is the best choice? Now for those who might just be getting into PC gaming, I want to talk quickly about the memory capacity of each of these GPUs and what this actually means for gaming. So quite simply, this number, for example 4GB or 8GB, refers to the capacity of video memory that each GPU has access to. So for example, in the case of the RX 570, both the 4GB and 8GB model have identical compute performance. However, in games where the 4GB or more of video memory is used, the 8GB model will usually pull ahead. However, in the case of the GTX 1060, the 3GB and 6GB model are indeed a different model of GPU with different compute performance aside from the video memory capacity. The 3GB GTX 1060 uses the GP106-300 GPU with 1152 CUDA cores, whereas the 6GB model uses 1280 CUDA cores. But different specs aside, here's the amount of video memory that I measured in games that we're looking at today, with these games running at 1080p ultra settings. So generally at 1080p, 3GB of video memory is good enough for the majority of games. However, there definitely are games that can chew up quite a bit. You'll still be able to play those games, of course, but you'll just need to drop the textures down a bit, down to around medium or high, and this way you'll avoid any stuttering. Both the 6GB and 8GB GPUs that we're testing today are good to go in all of these titles, and even the 4GB models like the RX 570 and RX 580 should be fine in Battlefield 5, at least in the map that I've tested today. And for testing, I'm using an 8700K overclocked to 5GHz paired with 3200MHz CL16 memory, and I'm using the most recent drivers at the time of filming, namely 416.94 for the GeForce GPUs and 18.11.2 for the Radeon GPUs. And let's jump straight in with Battlefield 5, and here I am testing single player due to the repeatability between benchmark runs. We're also testing with DX11 here, as DX12 has been a bit of a mess in this game, generating quite a lot of stutter, but I did actually read today that it has improved, so we might test that coming up. Still, despite testing with DX11, the Radeon GPUs are absolutely killing it in this title, with the RX 580 able to push an average of 82.6 FPS at 1080p ultra settings, a 15% lead over the 6GB GTX 1060. Even the RX 570 here is performing quite strong for the price. Moving on to For Honor, things switch a little bit, with the 6GB GTX 1060 now taking the lead by 2.6%, with a strong result for the lowest 1% of FPS as well. I also want to mention that the difference between the 8GB and 4GB RX 570 is not due to the margin of error or video memory limitations, rather it's due to the power limit and clock speed differences between these two cards, which we'll talk about a little bit later. In DX12 titles where it's implemented properly, we do see very strong results for those AMD GPUs. The 8GB RX 580, for example, is a very strong performer here with a decent lead over the more expensive 6GB GTX 1060. However, in Witcher 3, the GTX 1060s do have the edge over the Radeon GPUs, although the extra price you pay, I don't think is worth it for that 2% or so difference. Now, you're probably also wondering why I've included the 1050 Ti in these benchmarks, as it is really struggling to keep up. And the reason is that currently the 1050 Ti pricing is at around $159 US, which is $10 more than the current RX 570 4GB at $149. That is abysmal value in comparison, but we'll discuss that properly in just a minute. In Project Cars 2, I did measure the 3GB GTX 1060 a few FPS higher than the 8GB RX 580, but this is the only game where I measured this result, and on average, the RX 580 is much faster. Unfortunately, Warhammer Vermintide 2 doesn't play nice with DX12 with slower results overall, so I have tested with DX11 here. Still, the 8GB RX 580 manages to match the GTX 1060 6GB, at least on average FPS, creating a virtually identical playing experience. The 1060 was absolutely crushed in Rainbow Six Siege though, where even the 4GB RX 570 was 7.3% faster than the 6GB 1060, with the RX 580 almost 20% faster in this title. That lead is swapped though in Overwatch, where I measured the 6GB 1060 to be 17.1% faster than the 580. So of course we can look at the average results in just a minute, but I really do recommend choosing the best GPU for the games that you're actually playing. And I also want to mention that despite recommending the Radeon GPUs throughout these tests, it's not like I'm trying to make them look good by testing only AMD optimized titles. Ghost Recon Wildlands, for example, is an NVIDIA optimized title. However, we do see about only a 6% lead for the 6GB GTX 1060 over the RX 580. And lastly, the RX 580 is the far superior choice for Hitman 2, and here we are even testing with DX11 as DX12 doesn't seem to be implemented here just yet. Alright, now let's take a look at the averages for each GPU, and here we're comparing them against the RX 570 8GB for a bit of perspective. The 3GB GTX 1060 is 3.5% faster, the 6GB 1060 is 9.5% faster, and the RX 580 tops the chart as the fastest GPU that we're testing today and is 10.6% faster. Again, the 4GB RX 570 is slower than the 8GB model here, mostly due to power limit differences between them. And now taking a look at all of the GPUs against the 6GB GTX 1060, where the RX 570 is about 8 to 10% slower, but the RX 580 does come out on top and is 1.1% faster on average. Now that's not a huge difference at all, but the real conversation is regarding value, where the RX 580 is the much superior option. So here we're looking at how much FPS we're getting per dollar spent on these GPUs, and I've sourced pricing from Amazon US and Newegg. So at the bottom of the chart, we have the 1050 Ti giving us 0.31 FPS per dollar. And at the top, we have the RX 570 4GB at a monster 0.48 FPS per dollar. The RX 580 is also not only beating the 6GB GTX 1060 on FPS, but it's also doing it at $50 less as well. And for what used to be a reasonably priced GPU due to the price elevated mining chaos a few months ago, the 1050 Ti has actually gone up in price since then, whilst the other GPUs have dropped, and hence making it the worst choice in the stack. Okay, and lastly, a quick look at power consumption, and it's really to no one's surprise at this point that the Radeon GPUs are a much more power hungry lineup than the GeForce ones. So if you're really concerned about your power bill, it might be something to consider, although given the amount of money that you're saving initially with these cards, the trade-off is worth it in my opinion. And also do note that there's two values for the 4GB RX 570 here. This is the Asus Expedition model that is extremely power limited out of the box, and this initially yielded very poor benchmark results that I had to repeat, but after raising the power limit, we did correct those. So in my opinion, the RX 570 and RX 580s are an absolute no-brainer in my opinion over the comparatively priced GeForce GPUs like the 1060 and the 1050 Ti's. The performance there is not only better on average, but you are paying around $50 less. The value for the 4GB RX 570 is quite frankly insane. It's a steal for $149. And as always, you can check pricing down below for your region. There's of course the added benefit of being able to utilize FreeSync monitors with these Radeon GPUs to avoid screen tearing in games, whereas if you wanted to pick up a G-Sync monitor with your GeForce GPU, you're looking at spending at least an additional $100 to $200. Now the 8GB RX 570 and RX 580 models that I'm using were borrowed from MSI, and these are their Mech 2 cards. And although the color scheme might not appeal to a whole lot of you, these are some of the cheaper models that are going around, and I can definitely recommend them on a performance level. They weren't heavily power limited like my Asus model, and the thermals were in check below 70 degrees during testing. So guys, there's my final thoughts on the current situation with these budget to mid-range GPUs with their current pricing. And of course, the conversation and final verdict is always changing depending on these price drops and whatnot. But as I said, the RX 570 and RX 580 are the superior options given their current pricing over the GTX 1060s and of course the 1050 Ti. So that's it from me guys. Pricing is down below if you want to check it out. A huge thanks for watching, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one.